I want to make sure to let you guys know that this was my first time doing an epoxy countertop. So more than anything, I'm trying to share with you the things I would do differently, what I learned, what worked for me, and what didn't, so you can avoid some of the mistakes that I made. And this is by no means a video of an expert epoxy counter pourer and showing you what they did. This is just, it was cool. It was a fun project and kind of the things that I learned and would avoid. So the first thing that I did was I rounded the corners. I was doing a pour over my existing but damaged laminate countertops. And so I rounded my corners because I wanted to make sure when I did my epoxy pour, it actually went over the edges and coated them well. So I used a sander with a high grit sandpaper, but if you had a router, you could also do that as well. Next, I took wood filler and I filled in the gaps in the front where the front panel of laminate was missing, or anywhere that there was a big gouge. I've seen some of the people that seem more experienced also do this with Bondo, so you probably should use that. I hadn't seen that until after I did this. Once that all had time to dry, then I sanded the fronts smooth. I chose to remove my sink before I did the epoxy pour and when I prepped everything, but some people just tape it off. That's kind of a personal preference and what you're comfortable with for the scope of your work. So I took my sink off and then I wanted to clean the counters really well. So I started by just running a razor blade over everything, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here, but a razor blade is a great cleaning tool. I wanted to degrease and get any chunks of anything that felt like it was off, scraped off the counters really well before I did a base coat. I cleaned the whole countertop with a degreaser and a textured sponge, and I also did a fine grit sand over the whole top. I figured that would get any grease or debris or anything that I couldn't see. If you don't have a backsplash or you took off your backsplash like I did here, there is probably a gap between the back of your countertop and your wall. Now, this epoxy to an extent is made to self-level, so you don't want to have anywhere that it could drip or ooze through. One, because that's going to be wasteful, and two, it's going to make a huge mess. So what I did was I ran a bead of caulking along this line. Now, I knew my base of my counter was going to be white, so I used a white latex caulk. If you didn't know it was going to be white or it was going to be a different color, you could use a clear. The important thing is, do not use silicone. Silicone caulk is basically made to try to make things not stick to it. And so you don't want to have any issues with your epoxy connecting to the base, the silicone as the base. So just make sure that you're not using a silicone caulk here, but you need to fill this gap somehow. All right, for good measure, before I started my base coat of primer, one final coat of cleaning. I did a base coat of primer and layers of white paint until this was a nice solid white. It took a couple of coats. You're just gonna have to play it by ear and get it how you want it to look, but obviously you have to let a coat dry, come back, do another coat. Otherwise, if you try to paint over a wet coat, it just pulls the paint back off. I'm super excited. The time has finally come where we're gonna try to do some of the veining. So I have as many coats of white as it takes to get your counters to look uniform. You don't want it to look blotchy, or, you know, when you paint something that's laminate, that's what I started with, right? So you get a solid base coat unless you're gonna do like a pour of a bunch of epoxy. I'm doing white, I'm painting some veining on, and then I'm just gonna do a clear epoxy pour over the top. So I have watched a ton of videos online, on Instagram, on YouTube, tutorials, and so I kind of just bought everything that it seemed like people were trying for their veining. And so I got, one person said they used a blush brush. I don't know if this is a blush brush. I don't really do makeup good, but it's big. And so I thought it'd be good if I wanted to do a chunky vein. And then I did get one that specifically said it was a blush brush. No, it's a multi-face brush. So I got that. I figure if I don't use them, I can just take them back. I saw some people use feathers. It looked like they were using a bigger feather, more natural feather. This is just like a fake craft feather, but I figure we'll try it or have it on hand. Just a bunch of different brushes, because for the thin parts of the vein, or if you do a thick vein with like a darker color on the edge, people kind of, it seemed like they they pulled very lightly the brush and kind of twisted it as they pulled it. So I have a bunch of different sizes and I didn't know how firm or soft these were, so I wanted options. And then I just got a couple more options that I thought I might need for like a thinner veining. And then I got a spray bottle because it seemed like you kind of have to keep your paint wet so you can spread it out. So it seemed like people were doing a lot of spraying, so I just got this to put water in. I got apparently a Red Bull the other night that I forgot about. And then I just got a bunch of different colors of acrylic grays and whites, which obviously if you have black and white, you can make gray. But so it looks like I got a white and a black, which I honestly don't think I'll probably use the black because I want these to be pretty light and minimal. But I got them just in case, so if I was in the middle of it and I needed them, I had them. And then I just got some acrylic craft paints, so this is probably even darker than I'll want to go, but it's a dark granite. This one's called Dolphin Gray, it's really light. And then this is called Timeless Gray. So I think I'm probably gonna mostly use these and then maybe adjust them a little bit with white, but we'll see. So I'm just gonna kind of start. A lot of the things people said that I watched that they used a practice board, but then they said the practice board was a little bit different texture than what they were working on. And then also my concern was, since, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. My concern was, have you ever done a practice version of something and done like a super good job, and then you do the real thing and you're like, oh my gosh, my practice was so much better. If I do this horrible, this is just painted, so I can paint over it. Yeah, it's gonna take some coats to cover it. So I'm just gonna kind of start and hope for the best. But if you wanna start with the practice board, start with the practice board, totally your call. So let's get to it. I just wanna give you guys a heads up. I'm gonna do a decent amount of time here going over the veining process, because for me, when I watched other videos, a lot of people would talk about what they did, but I wanted to know how they made their faux veins. So feel free to scrub through what you want to see and what you don't. This kind of gets lengthy. I'll do a full length where I'm kind of learning as I go on the veining, and then I'll show you a couple time lapses too. So don't feel like you have to watch it all. That's just there in case you want it, because that was something I was really worried about learning for myself. I have a bunch of my stuff ready right here. So like maybe if we did like one big vein, I don't know. And people just kind of twist it as they go. Now, I think I need to keep this really wet. So I maybe should have. I even saw somebody do this and they actually put a bunch of the white down first to try to like make this spread out more really, but like, see, I need. So let's try this. I saw one girl's video and she did like a bunch of the white, and you kind of just work in sections, because if you do this all at once, it's like if you went all the way across, you're going to, it's gonna dry. But I do think I maybe let the brush I'm using right now, it's a little wet, so this might kind of be my spreading brush. What I'm trying to do is like a chunky vein that has like a little bit of a darker edge to it. So one thing I saw people doing also is when they had this, what they're using is their dry brush, they're working really hard to keep their dry brush dry. So it's not getting smeared in all the colors like that first blush brush I was starting with. Because we want to blend this, but I don't want it to look like sponge painting either. If you grew up in my era with sponge painting, you know that's really not the look we're going for, because everything was sponge painted. Every single thing was sponge painted. So I feel like we maybe need this to be a little bit more gray, but I didn't like my darker gray. It's almost showing a little bit brown on here. I liked my lighter gray. So I think I'd rather use my lighter gray and darken it up than use the darker gray that I bought. So I'm trying to blend this so it doesn't look like a sponge paint, but I'm kind of just taking it back off. So it keeps getting darker and then it keeps getting lighter. But I guess that's okay because we could kind of layer it and then it's gonna look more natural. Now I'm just kind of adding in some darker gray just to kind of like give it some detail. And the more you have like light gray, dark gray, I think if you use more colors too, you would have more, you know, detail. So like if you wanted more depth or whatever, but I'm kind of just liking things a little simple, and also I'm a little afraid to mess it up. So like some I'm distorting more than others, and some I'm leaving a little more defined. And I also think that kind of gives us more detail. So ultimately, if you're painting this, if you really mess it up, you could paint over the whole thing and start over. So nothing's the end of the world, nothing's forever. Everything is fixable. I do have a paint bristle in there. It might be a good idea to have like a little pair of tweezers on site, actually. Now I'm kind of wondering, what would it look like if we just added like a little bit of white details in here? Is it good or is it not good? So just like we were doing with the gray, but like instead, little bits of white. Just more detail. Yeah, that actually looks really sharp. I think I like I would be okay with this. There might be more I can add to it, but I think I'm gonna leave this and go to a different section. Here's just a quick time lapse of the next vein that I did. So whenever it starts looking too, I don't know, it looked too dark, heavy, and like, I don't want it to look sponge painty. So whenever it would start to look sponge painty, I just added a little bit of water because it blends almost like a watercolor. So when it looks like you have like these really clear sponge marks, if you spray a little bit of water and spread, it kind of blends it. Then you gotta let it dry a little bit, and then you go in and you start adding your detail, and you're gonna blend those in a little bit, but you're not gonna blend them in as much. And part of what makes this look, I think, natural is we have like these divots, right? So it's not solid gray, it's not solid white. We have these variations where we have different colors of gray, different colors of white, and you can either buy those or that can just come from using a different amount of white in your gray or black in your gray. And so we want these voids. And so that's kind of what I'm working on now, is just kind of these little weird spots like that, where just a little bit of white blends in and out, and then a little bit of gray blends in and out. We'll do both. And so like here, this blend to me looks kind of cheesy, so I'm gonna put like a lot of white in there, just so it is pretty nice white blend into the white on the counter. This is the same white. I have a white I'm using that isn't the white on my counter, but when I'm trying to blend my edges, I have my countertop white, the same white. We also just want, right, some little, so I go dark gray up here, I'm just put a little bit of white in there alongside it to just give just a variation against that dark gray. So now I think I have whitened this up a lot. I'm gonna go ahead and get some gray now. Make sure your brushes, every once in a while, I'm having to stop and take my brush and really get all the paint off of it, because once it's dry, you really want that loose, bristly texture. So I'm using a lot of paper towels. Got that loose bristliness. So then we can come back with some gray and add like, so I have like some white there, a nice little vein of gray. And some spots you'll like leave it, like you won't do a lot to it, but some spots you'll blend it. I'm blending pretty much everything because I don't have a good enough hand to just kind of, but if you blend it wet, it's gonna blend out more. If you blend it dry, it's gonna stay more defined, but you have to be careful. This brush I have is getting a little bit, you can tell I've been using it, so I think I might have to get a clean, just dry brush. But see now, just having those little veins of color, how much more detailed that looks. You can just go in and add detail until you're satisfied with the level of detail that you have in your veining. Remember, if you mess up, you could paint over this whole thing and start over. There were a couple of times where I realized that I had to step away, let it dry a little bit, and then come back and do more detail because it was kind of blending because it was too wet. Another thing I want to point out is make sure you finish your veins over the edge. See how that wraps? That makes it look more real. If you had a fake piece of laminate on the top and it didn't wrap around the edge, right, it would look really fake. So wrap those veins around the front, waterfall them down. Now, when we pour the epoxy, it's going to run over the edge. That's how we cover the fronts of it. So you really want to make sure that you protect your cabinets beneath. I wasn't so worried about my floor because it was exposed and I'm going to put new flooring down. So I had a margin of error that you would not if you had an existing floor. But I taped off the cabinets and I just really made sure I protected everything really well. And then the other thing that I did before I started was all my tools that I was going to be using. So you can either use a torch or you can use a heat gun to blow out the air bubbles in the epoxy. I cleaned those down really well with Clorox wipes because I wanted to make sure that no dust or debris fell off of those into the fresh epoxy pour. Now, there's a couple things that I feel like nobody talks about when they talk about their epoxy countertops. And when I went to do my pour, I of course mixed my epoxy to the instructions that my epoxy came with. And so I'm not going to go over that here because you might use whatever brand. And then I cleaned off the counters really well with a tack cloth to make sure there was no debris on them. And of course my paint was dry. And despite my best efforts, there was just a couple things, probably from the air. The place was clean, you lint roll your shirt, and a little piece of tiny fine little hair from whatever or fuzz or something is going to show up on that beautiful smooth countertop. And I actually ended up having to do 2 pours because the first pour I kept messing with it, and every little thing that I saw I'd pick it out, and I worked it too long beyond its working life. And so when it set up the next day, there were some little divots in it. So I lightly sanded it and I did a second coat, and I had to realize I had to just GTFO. I had to leave it alone. And so there were a couple places where I saw the finest, tiniest little hair landed in the epoxy, but it had already started to set up. If I would have pulled that out, then it would have had a little divot there, and I was more worried about having a smooth surface. So if you find a solution to this, let me know. But ultimately, I think you need to accept the fact that something in the air may land in your epoxy despite how well you try to clean it out and keep the place clean and keep the air clean in the area. So once you pour it, you can't keep messing with it over and over again, or you're going to have divots. You're going to use either a torch or a heat gun, but my manufacturer recommended a torch to go over the epoxy as it sets up because it's going to create air bubbles. You can't get it too hot or it will burn it, and it will discolor. You can see it. So you gotta, kind of find the right balance of holding it high enough and not holding it in one place for too long. To spread the epoxy over the horizontal surface, the flat surface of the counter, I used a V-notch trowel, which is what my manufacturer recommended, and that was perfect because it made it kind of uniformly spread. But what I did when, like right after I did everything else before the epoxy and my bucket started to set up, is with my glove, I just went and rubbed it on the faces, on the fronts of the countertops, because I wanted to make sure those had a good coating on them. So I went and rubbed all those spots in with epoxy, and then it flowed into that too. What I've heard is where epoxy goes, and it helps it blend it. So I went ahead and did that. One super helpful thing I did was I wore multiple layers of gloves. So when one got messy, I could pull it off and I had another layer underneath. If you have ever worked with rubber gloves or done food service or anything like that, you know that once you pull off a glove, your hand is sweaty and wet and it's hard to get a new glove on. So I had multiple layers so I could just pull them off as I needed to. The epoxy is going to drip over the underside of the overhang of your countertop. So if you're there for a little while after you pour it, you can run your gloved hand underneath of it and just smooth it so you have less drips. But ultimately, unless you stay the whole time it cures, you're going to have drips and you're just going to sand them off later. Here was what the pour looked wet when I left that night after pouring. Here's what those drips look like once they dry, and we're just going to sand them down. And here is our final product. If you want to see how the rest of the kitchen refresh turns out, make sure you subscribe, and that will be one of my upcoming videos. Thanks, guys.